Hello, and welcome to an episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. Today I'm going to be talking to Erlend Tellnes of the Equinor Out international campaign, and we're going to be chatting about Norway and Equinor and how this international campaign is pushing for Equinor to get out of oil and gas. For those of you unfamiliar with the subject, Equinor is the majority state-owned Norwegian oil and gas company, and it has projects proposed all around the planet. Primarily, it works in oil and gas. In fact, the vast majority of its work is in oil and gas, despite the fact that Equinor does try to brand itself as an energy company with different interests in renewable energy. We're also going to be chatting a little bit about the similarities and differences between Norway and my province of origin, Newfoundland and Labrador. How both places have a dependency on oil and gas, but different sort of dependency, but how both are facing challenges now as the world transitions to renewable energy at a faster and faster pace. Sierra Club Canada is happy to be a part of the Equinor Out campaign, and Erlend is the new campaign coordinator, coordinating a campaign that stretches across more than 3 continents with multiple countries and multiple different issues. I hope you enjoy this interview with Erlend Tellnes. If you'd like to find out more about Sierra Club Canada, please make sure to check out our website, sierraclub.ca. You can also find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, X, or Twitter. We are starting something new as part of this podcast series. We're going to have a Q&A now at the end of each episode. We'll be doing the first of these in the next episode in the series. And if you have a question for us, please reach out to us at communications@sierraclub.ca, and we'll try to get your question in the next episode. All right. So, Erlend, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you. No, I'm good. Yeah, good here from Oslo.
Tell us a little bit about, who you are and how you got connected with the Equinor Out campaign, and maybe like some background, what you've done in the past as well.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Erlend. I'm an oil and climate campaigner. I'm based in Oslo. I worked for Greenpeace the last, almost 11 years with oil on from different angles. So I've been working with the Greenpeace ships for a few years, worked with Greenpeace International, but mostly with the Norwegian team here at Greenpeace, where we've been kind of fighting Equinor and trying to influence the state to go away from oil and into renewables. And before that, I have my background from Nature and Use. It's a youth organizations working on oil and climate and several other issues here in Norway. Yeah, so that's a bit about me. And then since this August, I came back to Greenpeace Nordic, and then really happy to come on board with the Equinor Out team and come back to kind of what I've been working on for many years on oil and climate here in Norway. So yeah, happy to be back.
Well, I'm good to have you back, and I guess I'm curious that cycle back now that you're focusing on this work. How do you feel the sort of like the issues have changed from when you first started maybe dealing with oil and gas issues to now? Like, is there a difference in the urgency that you're feeling coming back to this?
I think when I started, it's more than 10 years ago, oil and climate were seen as 2 very different things. So you had the climate policies, and they were about electric cars, emissions from industry, about recycling, about the parks and putting up benches and all kind of things. And then you had the oil policies which was only about money, making money for the budget, and it was completely separate. And I think we've seen during the last years that in Norway these 2 things has been merged. I think that's one of the great victories we had. Now when we talk about oil, we talk about climate, and we talk about emissions. So I think that's maybe the biggest change we had during these years. I think we had some years recently where climate has been very in the center of the public discourse. And now we're a bit in a dip. There's a lot of other things happening in the world, which obviously takes some of the focus, and they are urgent and important, but we have a job to do to get climate back in the conscious mind of people and in the politics here as well. If we should be able to transition the society away from oil, then we have to do that job.
Yeah. Well, and I've noticed that is a connection to some extent between the conversations that we're having about global energy security, the conversations we're having about how do we ensure that countries have energy independence, right? And this is a big issue, particularly in Europe. I know for Norway as well, this is a big topic issue. And the connections between that and also climate change, because there does seem to be this inherent kind of connection between growing renewable energy and having global energy security. I don't know if you've dealt much with that, or if you're seeing that much in Norway as an issue.
Norway is more or less self-sustained on energy. We have a lot of hydropower that produces electricity, and this covers all the Norwegian need. And then we have cables to Europe and the UK to balance it out if we have dips. And then we produce a lot of oil and gas, and we export almost all of this. So kind of energy independence for Norway, it's not an urgent issue. It's more about kind of the responsibility we have as an oil nation and an energy nation, and all the emissions that comes with all the oil that we export. That's, I think, the one side of it. And the other side is the responsibility we have to kind of use some of that competence we have in the oil and energy industry to help build up some of the solutions. So I think we're going to talk more about Equinor, and they have a lot of flaws and bad priorities, but I think there are some things they're really good at, and that's kind of running big projects, running offshore projects, and that, like those smart heads that goes into that company could be spent so much better if they were helping us to develop and push the energy in offshore wind or in solar panels, or all those solutions that we really need to make Europe and so many other countries independent when it comes to energy, and be able to produce that energy themselves, without being dependent on other countries like Norway or Russia to provide that energy.
And so energy security is more of an issue on the supply side than the demand side for Norway, which does tie in very well to the central conversation we're going to be having today, which is, you're talking about Equinor and you're talking about the role on the global stage. And what do you think what do you think is the trade-off? Are there things they're doing well? Are there things that they're not doing well? And I'm wondering, what are some of the problems with the way Equinor is approaching global energy security? I mean, I'm asking this question. I already kind of know the answer. We've been working on this campaign together, but I'm so curious what you think, coming from that perspective of having dealt with them and worked with these issues in Norway for such a long time.
Yeah, so I think Equinor they're first of all, they're a fossil fuel company. And then it's still a very small part of the company that are doing anything green. So they're still investing mostly, or almost all of their investment goes to oil and gas, while still like less than 1% of their energy production is renewables. And we've seen, like, if we look some years back, we've seen from time to time they have green projects and they have invested in renewables here and there. And this hasn't been very successful, so they've pulled out. And then in the last couple of years, I think probably because the society is changing and there is a push to go into renewables, they want to brand themselves as a broader energy company. Then they kind of have started up again their investments. So now they have some projects on renewable, like offshore wind, and they have some hydrogen projects, but still this is such a small part. So we should, like, it's easy to question if they take the green transition seriously, because it's like the investments are so small. I think that's the challenge. They haven't really changed their model. They're still focusing on oil and gas, and then they do the green investments as a side thing. And I think that's what's need to change.
That's the afterthought that they're getting to. And we see this a lot. I mean, we see this in Canada with companies to rebrand, or even agencies to rebrand as like, now we're the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Energy Agency rather than, petroleum board. Or lots of rebranding where people are calling themselves energy companies, and the reality is that their portfolio, what they're actually doing is like 90% to 99% oil and gas. It hasn't changed much at all. So there's this rebranding without the substance to back it up. I guess I'm curious, how does that play out for the Norwegian public? Like, how do they see Equinor, and how does that contrast with some of the things like you see and some of the things maybe you've been hearing from internationally about? Because Equinor is a company that works internationally. I mean, it leads on a lot of projects or is embedded in a lot of projects internationally. So I'm kind of curious what the public view is there in Norway versus maybe what we see elsewhere.
Yeah, so Norway is a quite small country. So we're about 5.5 million people. And Equinor, it's a major employer and one of, like, I think the biggest company we have. And they employ a lot of people. They provide a lot of jobs, not only directly in Equinor, but also all the jobs that are connected in some way. So all the hotels and the bars and everything that goes around that kind of major industry. On top of that, they kind of send a lot of money into the budget, which is good for people because they rebuild schools and hospitals and the welfare state from it. And they spend a lot of money on sponsoring things, so skiing and football and young talents and a lot of things. So they're building a really good reputation for themselves here in Norway. And I think that's also why their support by the Norwegian population is quite strong, because they've been such a kind of an integral part of, like, they're coming from being a state-owned oil company, which they still are. And a lot of people kind of, when they see Equinor and they see the oil industry, this is kind of what has built Norway to become the welfare state that it is. I think that's also why it's so hard to campaign against, because people see what the industry and the people has done and built the country. And then kind of when we're now looking forward, of course, things has to change because we have a climate crisis, and Equinor is the biggest, it's one of the really big contributors to that, to drive the climate emergency. It's hard to not look back on kind of what they've done. So I think that's some of the challenges we have on the green transition, that Equinor is shaping so much of the public discourse, influencing the debate on energy and on transition, that kind of real political force to change things are really lacking. And they're also becoming, I think, and more people are seeing it, from becoming the driver behind the Norwegian energy, they're becoming a threat, as they are kind of putting so much of our smart heads and young people are going into the oil industry, and we are kind of lack of options. So when the green transition really starts in the rest of the world and the world are changing, we have put in all our investments into oil, and then we're going to be seeing kind of unemployment. We're going to see the kind of the transition really starting to go forward. We're going to have some issues that we have to solve. And we are seeing more politicians are starting to see this. And we've been saying it for many years, that we have to diversify, we have to look into other industries and how to build those up, and the new and the green ones.
It's really interesting to me what you just said, because I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador, which is in some ways there are similarities with perhaps Norway. It's an oil and gas producing area of Canada, right? have for a long time when I was growing up. Oil and gas was just it was the hope for the future. The funny thing about growing up there was that Norway was always held up as the example by a lot of people actually who were critical of the direction and policy that we'd taken in the past, of what we should have done, of what we could potentially do one day with oil. Like Norway was kind of like, well, we could have had a wealth fund. We could have had all these policies that supported people. We could have had this mass kind of public, it could have been the savior of the province. And that never really happened in Newfoundland and Labrador for a number of reasons. But I think one of them being that there are differences, right? And the oil industry was never going to be that singular savior. But there's still that mentality that it's going to be. And we're facing the same problem, which is not just public direct investment, right, in the oil and gas industry is at risk, because you invest all this money, and now we're talking about stranded assets across the world as these oil reserves that we're investing in developing turn out to be useless, turn out to be things we can't develop. But it's more than that, because as you say, it's like people on an individual basis invest their lives in it, right? They make a decision. I'm going to go to school, I'm going to study this because I'll have a job in the oil and gas industry afterwards. Or they make decisions like taking out a mortgage or buying really expensive stuff because they assume the industry is going to do well. And you can't blame people for when they have this sense of hope for wanting to invest in it. Like that's something that I've always felt a lot of sympathy for. Do you think that there's a growing awareness in Norway that something's coming, that a change is coming, or do you feel that it's still just only getting started?
I think we are like most people in Norway are living in a bubble when it comes to this. We saw some time back, we saw that we had something we called oil shame, which were people working in the oil industry feeling ashamed of working in an industry that were fueling climate change. But then after the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis in Europe, where this narrative has again changed completely. So now Norway has become a much bigger supplier with gas to Europe than it was before the invasion, and people in the industry feels more proud of kind of providing energy to Europe. So this climate shame, or this kind of transition that felt more urgent just a few years back, has had a bit of a setback. But the climate crisis hasn't gone away, and we are seeing forces in the EU kind of saying that we need energy, but we need green energy because it's more sustainable and it's the energy of the future. So Norway won't be able to kind of continue to provide energy to Europe for like forever, like people almost think here, like for a really long time. So we are going to see that kind of fall in the need for energy also for the export from Norway. And then, as you say, like it's the same here. We have a lot of people young people that goes into the industry. Some are highly educated. A lot of them are not. They're maybe 3 years at the university, or many also much less than that. And then they will go in, they will get a really high salary, they will buy a big house and a big car. And then if they lose that job, they kind of would have to, they wouldn't be able to pay their mortgages, and they would have to change the way they're living and maybe move to a new city to find a job and kind of go down in income and standards. There are still kind of, which is for them probably will be a personal challenge, but kind of compared to the challenges we have with the climate emergency and how many people are already being affected by climate change, of course it's not a massive problem, but something that Norway, of course, has to solve. Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting thing too, because I feel in Newfoundland and Labrador, at least, there have been enough economic crises caused because of oil at this point that I think there is a sort of natural skepticism. I think that there was a skepticism from the beginning that maybe this was kind of a propaganda piece, right? I think a lot of people were like, okay, and you see that skepticism fluctuate with what's happening actually in the market around oil. It feels like Norway has been better, maybe, at least from what I've heard. And again, we were also given, even by, I think, people who thought there was a good future to oil, would sometimes point to Norway, say, let's do what Norway did. And I think maybe this is a false impression, but I was always given the impression that like Norway was better insulated to some of those fluctuations, whereas in Newfoundland and Labrador was like, oh, something happened, the entire economy just collapsed overnight, and everybody's struggling. And so because of actually weirdly those economic collapses before, there does seem to be a kind of a growing awareness that this is not a very sustainable resource long term. It's not going to provide the sort of long-term stability, and particularly as we go into a time when, as you say, people could start losing their jobs overnight because the demand simply won't be there. I mean, when we talk about the pace of the economic transition that's happening, particularly in Europe, how do you feel that's going? Do you feel that's accelerating? Is it something that's going to be gradual, or are we looking at within this decade, problems within that supply demand cycle?
Yeah, I think, sorry, as you say, like we are in a very different time now than some decades ago when we really started to produce oil, and things are changing really quickly. And then we should also have in mind that the oil industry is a like cyclic industry. It follows the oil price. So when the price goes up, there is a lot of jobs, and then the price goes down, and then a lot of people has to go. And Norway is has managed this because we have a big wealth fund. Like we have put aside a lot of the money we made the last decades from oil into the world's biggest wealth fund, and then we could use this money to kind of smoothen out these cycles. And I think that's the one thing. The other thing is that, as you say, we're seeing the green transition taking speed many places and quickly, and we're seeing renewable energy being cheaper than fossils in some areas. Solar is kind of going really quickly, wind is going quickly. So yeah, the transition can go, hopefully, and hopefully it will go fast, and so we can kind of cut emissions. And that will be hard for countries like Norway that has put most of our eggs in one basket. We're putting, all our smart heads coming just out from the university into the oil industry to kind of look for more oil that the climate can't handle. So we have some challenges we have to change, and some trends we have to work on.
Totally, and I think that's very much a Canadian thing as well. Whether or not it's Newfoundland and Labrador, it's Alberta, or any of the other provinces that do have either a sizable dependence upon oil and gas, or that's a majority of their independence. So with climate change, I guess, what are some of the climate change impacts you're seeing in Norway? And we've experienced just this year massive forest fires in northern Canada and across other parts of Canada as well, that were devastating for a lot of communities. And we've seen flooding. I mean, just the other year, Border Basque was devastated by flooding and severe weather from Hurricane Fiona. I guess I'm curious, what sort of impacts are you seeing in Norway, and are people making that connection between the climate impacts and climate change?
Yeah, I think the impacts we're seeing in Norway are probably not as bad as what we're seeing in many other places in the world. We are kind of seeing some of the climate reports saying that kind of Norway would be some of the countries that will be the least impacted. But still, we are seeing some. Of course, we are also seeing the impacts here. We had a summer with extreme rain and flooding that were very dramatic for many people that lost their homes and their house in those floods. And in the last couple of years, we had droughts during the summers that are been harmful for the farmers, food production, and we are seeing as we can probably understand as Canadians as well, that we are a country that loves cross-country skiing. and we're seeing the seasons are getting shorter and shorter every year. And I think that's a few years back, the most read news story about climate was a story about how many less days of skiing we'll get with 2 degrees warming, which is, again, not as dramatic as flood or a drought, but still impacts a lot of lives. But then again, I don't think a lot of people in Norway connect that to climate change. Maybe they connect it to climate change, but they're not connecting it to Equinor or to oil production. And I think we have a job to do there as environmental organizations to make this link, even more clear in the years to come.
And I wonder if a bit of that ties into, we talked a little bit about the guilt, right? And the shame of working. And for many people back home, this is not really a choice, I've always tried to, I think we've always tried to be clear in our climate activism. And certainly, I've always tried to be that the people I would see as to blame are the CEOs and the lobbyists, not the person who's working for the oil and gas industry because they have to, right? So there's on the one hand that shame that I feel is almost counterproductive because it blocks out seeing the connections, right? Like there needs to be at some point an acceptance that yes, some people work for the oil and gas industry because they have to, and it's not, that doesn't mean that you can't accept that oil is responsible for climate change. Those impacts, even though, we could say that the impact of, on cross-country skiing is less than, say, a severe storm. I grew up downhill skiing, so similar, but, there were a lot of cross-country skiers nearby. I never had the patience for it. But that's a tourism industry, right? That's something that communities do rely upon, or that they seek out as a way to make income, and people work. I know people who work as ski patrol instructors, right? That's how they make the money or things like that. So, it's not, as we see these impacts, there are lots of smaller impacts that add up, and they add up for communities. And I think particularly a lot of rural communities see, unfortunately, both. They see the flooding and the storms and the fires, and at the same time they see the local economy suffering from whatever it is, droughts, a lack of snowfall. Indigenous communities in the far north use ice for being able to do traditional practices, being able to transport things, and being able to move between places, and that ice is degrading. So I think all of those are very legitimate things. For people who do want to do more, you mentioned there's that work to be done to make those connections between oil, Equinor, climate change, and the impacts. What should people be doing? How can they be most effective in helping to make those connections?
I think Equinor is a company that they are present in many regions around the world. So we're seeing they're having projects in Canada. They also have in Brazil and in Argentina and in the UK and in Tanzania and many places. And we are seeing that they are to some extent vulnerable to local resistance, that if it gets too uncomfortable for them, they would kind of pull out. So it's kind of so it matters to protest and to highlight those projects and the impacts that they have. But we're seeing that when Equinor goes into a new country to join into a project, they also maybe not all the places, but in many places they are trying to buy their social license as well. So like we're seeing in UK, they're sponsoring art exhibitions. I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Canada, they've been sponsoring kind of skiing and cross-country skiing teams. In the Nordic, they're sponsoring, I'm not sure if they still do it, but I think they did at least some years back doing that. In the Nordic, they're sponsoring Lego, kind of making like oil fuels, like fuel station out of Lego that kids would play with. So they do a lot of things kind of to buy their acknowledgement, their kind of social license in the society. And I think it's like this needs to be called out. They're not doing that to be nice. They're doing that because they want the approval by people to do their operations and to invest in oil and extract even more oil and gas. So kind of to protest against them in all the places where they are engaged has an effect, and is also a way of kind of linking what they do to climate change and all the impacts that we already been talking about that come from the climate emergency and the climate change.
Well, Erlend, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to chat to you more as things progress. I think we're all involved in some way in trying to fight back against these projects. And if people do want to find out more, is there a website they should be visiting in Norway at all to find out more information?
Yeah, we're putting out a lot on the Greenpeace page, greenpeace.no. And then we also, there we have a really nice report that came out recently where we are summarizing their operations in different regions and the impact they have. And we're also about to set up a new webpage where we also will be presenting the challenges with their investments around the world. So keep an eye out for that one as well when it comes.
Thank you, Erlend.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you all once again for joining us for another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I want to say a special thank you as well to Erlend for joining us today. I know for first-hand experience just how difficult a coordinated campaign of this size can be, but it's been amazing to see this campaign continue to grow, and it's such a wonderful thing to be a part of and a sense of international solidarity that it brings. You can find out more about Sierra Club Canada at sierraclub.ca. You can also find us on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, all the others. We will be posting some links as well below to where you can find out more about the Equinor Out campaign. We definitely encourage you to continue to keep up with it, to support actions as they come around. Thank you all again for tuning in and continuing to take action.